Good afternoon. I'm Paul Harding from the fiction faculty at Stony Brook's creative writing program. Welcome everyone to our latest episode of Shop Talk, aka Imagine Wednesdays, aka Writers Speak, all sponsored by Stony Brook Creative Writing in its inexhaustible abundance. Among us gathered here on YouTube are faculty members, current MFA and BFA students, people from the community who would normally attend in person, applicants interested in our programs at the graduate and undergraduate levels, and CWL 202 students whose professors are making them attend. Behind the scenes making all this happen is Frank Imperial, our tech genius. Today we are especially thrilled to have a double bill for you. Two authors who have pulled off one of the greatest of feats, writing a first novel and getting it published. Before I introduce them, let me describe the format of how these readings work. Each author will read for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll take questions from you all from the chat feed. You can type in your questions at any time. Don't worry, you won't interrupt the reading. You won't interrupt us. Also, we found that conversations sometimes develop while the readings are going on, so feel free to comment on what you're hearing as well as the reading is happening. Most of all, though, we want you to enjoy yourselves. So our first reader is Simeon Marsalis. He is a native of New Rochelle, New York, and has lived in New York City and New Orleans. He graduated from the University of Vermont with a degree in religion in 2013. The poet Major Jackson writes that Simeon's debut novel, As Lie Is to Grin, quote, courageously works through the fraught legacy of race and the color line, often transgressed with deep psychological consequences. In this haunting tale of one young man's search for himself, Marsalis shuffles and refigures time so that our troubled history no longer hides in plain sight. This is superb writing that feels ceremonious in its wisdom and inexhaustible in its offerings. Please welcome Simeon Marsalis.
Hello, thank you all. Thank you for having me. Thank you very much. I just want to speak for a second, hopefully no longer than a minute before I start reading, and just say I hope everybody's safe and you're taking care of yourself and your family members. I recently lost my grandfather last Wednesday. This is his picture. Wait, which side? Oh, there it is. Above me. And this, what I'm going to be reading from today is actually an excerpt from a new work that I'm doing. And this new work has a lot of roots in my old work. I was editing As Lies to Grin when I was living in New Orleans. I was living actually in my grandparents' house, and there's a gazebo out back, and I used to work out there, and my grandfather always used to call it my office. So in that office, I kind of was editing As Lies to Grin, and there's a moment at the end of it where David begins to, I guess you can say, unravel. For people who haven't read it, I hope you do read it. But there's a thing that David, who's the protagonist of that novel, says, which is he's reading the newspaper and he recognizes that the point was not to try to perceive reality as it was presented, but all at once, without the burden of history. And this new project I took on kind of starts from there. I went through an MFA as I was trying to figure out this new work. And kind of the basis point of it is Toni Morrison's Recitative, the story in which she obscures the race of her two main characters. But I was really interested in deracializing a world that I had so racialized in the first novel. So I hope you all enjoy it. Also, for my MFA students out there, continue to struggle. If you like experimental work, if you want to experiment with your work, continue to talk through it with your teachers and advocate for yourself and advocate for what you believe in, but also definitely listen to your classmates and the guidance that you have. The last thing I'm going to say before I start reading is that I was editing this novel all the way up until March 4th, which already feels like years ago. And for some reason, I decided to set this novel in a not so distant future, in a place called City. And that's all you'll need to know. The date 377 corresponds with the year 220. So I hope you all enjoy. Also, sorry, one last thing before I actually start. My mother asked me about the title. She asked me if I was going to continue to name it End Times. And I'm not 100% sure yet, but it is the title that I've been using. So without further ado, and with a slight trigger warning for our times, End Times. The end began on a Friday in City, which should have been my day off, but Raisa asked me to take her shift. Share the floor with Parsifal, she said. I would serve and he would bus and we would split the run. This was not the restaurant's policy, but the arrangement seemed fair because there were not many customers that day and Parsifal was not particularly good at his job. He came to the patio and seated himself in the chair across from me just after 14 o'clock and tried to paper over our disagreements with vague stimuli that were somehow significant, he was trying to convince, when his seat began to creak. I reached into my pocket for a wedge when over his head I could see a tram had stalled on the track near Avenue M. 3 figures glanced upwards from the pavement as if to divine the commotion. When Parsifal tapped me so hard on the shoulder, I dropped the triangle. A vision had appeared to him in the clouds he tied to an idea he'd heard from his cousin who lived up north near 101st Street and Avenue Q. The animals in City aren't real, he said, but there did not seem to be a feasible perpetrator for this hoax. I said so. And a short while later, a couple opened the door. I seated them on the patio. They began to argue before I realized the whole thing with Parsifal had fucked me up. He was by the kitchen speaking with the chef in a language I did not speak. I read the schedule of shifts, then called through the window between the restaurant, where I was, and the kitchen, where they stood. If Parsifal was so convinced of his theory, wouldn't he like to go visit City Farms 2 weeks from today, when we could schedule our next day off to prove it? He agreed. The shift ended. I left the restaurant without fanfare. There was something particular about the walk back through City at that hour that set me ill at ease. I began to regret all of the things that occurred, beginning with my favor for Raisa. I should not have taken her shift. I should not have challenged Parsifal. If he had been D, I thought, when I found myself staring at the wire banner that hung over a neighborhood I did not know well. It was an affluent place. The apartments were decorated with stone representations of plants in flower and animals in positions of predation. There the streets narrowed. You were always in the shadows. I was tiring of the heat, so I turned into Old Bienia. My salutations were often ignored. I turned left and then right. Each block passed, pushing me further under the haze of misdirection. Across the street, a royal blue awning appeared bearing the name Columbian Hotel. The bellhop seemed to gesture in my direction. Just as I got to his curb and decided to open my mouth, he uttered the name Diedrich, which startled me because I was not my grandfather. I turned around and jogged in a direction I assumed to be south until I reached the bus stop on 160th Street. I was trying to remain calm, alone, when an elderly woman who had several old garbage bags stacked in a cart sat next to me. From pursed lips and parted teeth, I learned that she spent 7 hours each day emptying public trash cans of recycling. She was not as interested in my opinion as she was in the idea that I should forgive the source of my anger, which, apparently, was written on my brow. I did not know the source of my emotions most times, I told her. The bus arrived, and we kissed each other on the cheek before she said something in Old Bienian that made her smile. At home, I cooked grains and vegetables in a pan because the conversation about animals with Parsifal had disturbed me. My eyes were glued to the situational comedy on the screen in the living room, company, when my feed cut out. I pressed the remote, but it did not change the state of things. Just as I had lost hope in my entertainment for the evening, the screen became animate again. Last night at the observatory on 53rd Street and Avenue R, astronomers discussed the possibility of a meteor that has been in our atmosphere for millennia crossing paths with our orbit in the near future. The camera panned to a wider angle, and his co-host asked, "Will we be able to see it?" "05-19-377. I took the 105th Street train north on Avenue G, bypassing the large gymnasium, then the museum, passing over Military Boulevard with my face pressed to the window again, watching Sector 11 become Sector 21. There had been nothing on the screen about the meteor all week, just news about how people were reacting to the news. Parsifal had showed me some places on the screens where people were trading conspiracy theories. The amount of loose thread was dizzying. I hoped to dispel some of his superstition. Even with the fate of city hanging in the balance, I thought. But when I arrived on 195th Street, I intended to tell Parsifal a joke I forgot because he was already upset. "It's Parsifal." We boarded the bus and sat near the backs next to two transient men and a mother with 3 children. My coworker was still upset. I tried to make small talk, but he would not entertain it. "Do you know how many batteries they're going to sell?" he asked. "I don't understand your logic," I said. "Never mind," he responded. Every other answer he gave was short. Maybe this wasn't the best week to help Parsifal cast aside his paranoia. At the entrance to City Farms, there was a sign that was made to attract children. The wood was plastic and the entrance was bounded by a metal turnstile that clicked each visitor in after they paid the fee. We got the city discount, but Parsifal was upset about the percentage of his salary or his presence. I did not know. It seemed that many of the workers had put in notice over the course of the last week, so there was only one guide on duty. He did not cite this irregularity until much later, though. He went on with the rehearsed greeting before we were all escorted through the gift shop to the farmland behind the entrance, where there was the reenactment of early A&E's farm practices being mimicked by citizens on the hill just in front of us. To the left, just next to the farmhouse, the guide waved our eyes in the direction of a pen of bovine, and we stood there for a while, before one of the tourists asked the guide, "Do you expect us to believe these cows service all of city?" No was the simple answer, but the guide displayed undue angst. He could not find an appropriate response, so after a while I yelled, "Of course not!" We moved on, but all of the confusion took hold of Parsifal's imagination. He started to say that everything smelled synthetic. As we approached the next pen, each animal he investigated meticulously to the point of disbelief, until almost 2 hours had passed, and one of the goats, named Ignatius, bit a child on the pointer finger, an act so random and at odds with what Parsifal believed the ethos of a simulation would be that it seemed to ease my coworker's mind. Though no sooner had we entered the food court had he become agitated again. "I just bit into this piece of meat and I realized it tastes just like the cow in city," he said. "We are in city," I responded. "True, I guess." When we attempted to re-enter the farm, the guide said another tour would cost 1/4 the amount of the first. I begged him to let us see the cows one more time for Parsifal's sake, and he obliged, which, I was realizing, had been a selfish acquiescence. He walked us right up to the animals and began to call Penelope, Penelope, who did not respond, though she was very near. She had become sick and everyone on the farm thought she would die, but she survived. He seemed to imply he'd had some hand in the cow's recovery. The tale brought my coworker to the point of tears, and I could not help but cringe. All of that human emotion for a cow. At least, Parsifal believed the animals were real again. It all seemed to have nothing to do with farming, but I was happy to see my coworker return to his mind. On the ride home, Parsifal was humming some harmony and looking out of the window as city passed us by. "This doesn't change anything about the meteor." I shook my head. There were not many people on the Avenue P bus, but a child from the front came to the back to spread herself across the bench. She was seeking attention, repeating the words "sub-bus" while kicking her feet in the same rhythm. Out of agitation, Parsifal said, "You A&Es don't know how to raise your children," but I could not see what in the girl's action had caused him such discomfort. When I could see that my desire to disabuse Parsifal of his fears was rooted in a desire I'd had 4 years ago, to save my grandfather from similar lines of thinking. He had convinced himself that this city was not the place we were living in, but some alternate expression of a distant present. It is unnatural, he would say, marching around that back room, moving back and forth between two fantasy texts written before 200 about some ideal city. My brow was furrowed now as I had receded into some past that was quite away from here. Parsifal tapped me on the shoulder, but I did not turn, and around 105th Street, more A&Es got on the bus. To be honest, I don't often refer to my people as A&Es. If anything, we were ABCians, but that name was outmoded, too long, and difficult to pronounce. My grandmother showed me the truth in the kitchen of their old apartment one morning with an apple skin. She cut the flesh into 3 pieces. This is where our species comes from, A. This is where we next settled, B. This is where we are, C. You are not A&Es, you are an A. Parsifal was not Siena, she was a C. But all of that recategorization still missed the heart of the issue. Everyone is from where they are from, regardless of where their ancestors hailed. That's not what I meant either. You seem agitated, he said. You offended me. Are you worried about this whole media business? It was clear he did not see the point, so I left my coworker at the bus station on 200th Street. Above city again, I put my hands to my bare knees and looked into the clouded window. We were just passing the museum when I had the sudden urge to shit. My mother's parents had lived in the neighborhood we were passing, and I wondered if my desire was not tied to my proximity to a known repository. There, below the tracks, was the abandoned house of worship where my cousins and I had played as children. My mother's mother, rest her soul, led a committee to get that place bulldozed. It was a hazard for school-aged children, a danger to the general public. Of course, the conservatives came out in large numbers to protest the bulldozing of the remains. It housed those without homes, among other things. My eyes were fastened to the tumbled buttress. Old city. The scene changed. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it.
That's great, Simeon. Thank you. Thank you so much. Our next reader is Donny Walton. Donny's forthcoming debut novel is Opal Nev, a fictional oral history about a fictional rock and roll duo. Donny has been a fellow at the MacDowell Colony, a Tin House scholar, and is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. When asked in an interview about whether she agrees with the old writing maxim about needing to kill your darlings, she answered that yes, she agrees with it, but, quote, save those little babies in a separate file. Just because they don't belong in a particular story doesn't mean they're not beautiful. Please welcome Dawnie Walton.
Hi, everybody. And thanks, Paul, for inviting me to be part of this. It is a little ray of sunshine during a very gray time. Simeon, my condolences to you and to your family. I know it's been a very difficult time for so many people, and I hope everyone tuning in is staying safe. And I appreciate you being here to hear this little piece of work. I'm going to read the beginning of my novel, Opal Nev. At least that's the title as of now. It won't be publishing for a while, not until 2021. But I'm going to be reading the opening pages. There's not a lot you need to know. The only thing to keep in mind is that the entire novel is to be read as a document. It's an oral history about an interracial proto-punk band in early 1970s New York City. And what I'm going to read is the foreword to this book, which is written by the editor who is curating the interviews. And she has, as you'll learn in this foreword, a very personal connection to the launch of Opal Nev. Disclosure. My father, a drummer named Jimmy Curtis, fell in love with Opal Jewel in the summer of 1970. At the time of their affair, he was married to my mother, who happened to be pregnant with me. Before my birth, before the world had a chance to know much about my father beyond these facts, he was beaten to death by a racist gang during the riot at Rivington Showcase. And before my mother could bury his broken body, his mistress blazed to stardom. This is a personal history that, throughout my life, I've taken significant pains to conceal. In my 25 years as a journalist, I've never needed to lean on it. I got here under my own steam, toured the world's most dazzling arenas with U2, won awards for following funny money raised by benefit concerts, even interviewed artists who, oblivious of my connections, cited Opal Jewel and Nev Charles, together and solo, as their heroes, Santa Gold, the White Stripes, the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, to name a few. All this work I've compiled as S. Sonny Shelton, the name I put to legal papers on my 18th birthday. My chosen name, this hard-earned byline, cobbles together the first initial of my birth name, my favorite word as a child, and the Philadelphia street where the umber facade of my maternal grandmother's row house decays, flake by flake. You could say that every decision I've made to divorce myself from the violent birth of Opal and Nev has been like this, intentional and a touch paranoid. So, you ask, what the hell am I doing now? Writing the foreword for a story I swore I'd never tell. I could justify my involvement in this project by explaining that the internet and cable news have changed the game for journalists, stretching the boundaries of what's possible and upending all the rules we thought we knew. I could tell you that in this new era, readers and television audiences now accept, even expect, a flavoring of bias. But I wouldn't want to bullshit you. This book exists because in March 2015, when I was named Arl's editor-in-chief, the first African American and first woman to win the gig since the magazine launched in 1965, I gave myself permission to write it. Understand that before my big come up, I'd been playing a game familiar to many women of color outnumbered in our industries. I worked hard, kept my head down, and made a meticulous, watertight case attached with data stuffed PowerPoints for every idea I ever pitched. And still, I worried that the reasons for my success would be questioned by even my most progressive white colleagues. I imagined that at cocktail parties, the bane of my socially anxious existence, they would gossip about me after I left their huddles, roll their eyes and snark to each other between bites of crab cake. Isn't diversity wonderful? After our young new publisher offered me the promotion, I nonetheless closed the door of my office on the 14th floor, opened the window that looked down onto Liberty Street, and screamed victory to the poor tourists below. I felt pride, of course, but something more, something better, freedom. Freedom to trust my tastes, take my own counsel, make bold moves. Here was a chance, or so I'd assumed, to pursue every fascination I had ever wanted to follow, but didn't feel that I could. I looked up at the 1972 Vogue photo of Opal Jewel that I'd pinned to a corkboard, its significance to me carefully shrouded among all the other rock memorabilia I kept there, and I thought, maybe it's finally time. As if on cue, like the supernatural force I'd always imagined her to be, Opal Jewel appeared in my life not long after that reverie. At the April 2015 taping of a Netflix special honoring studio wizards, the first high-profile event I'd attended since taking Earl's reins, I ran into her, literally ran into her, as in both of our clutches fell to the floor, her bullet of lipstick and my cell phone clattering across the marble. This happened inside the ladies' lounge at New York's Gotham Hall minutes before the event was scheduled to start. Nev was on the bill, set to play a couple of his old solo hits in tribute to Rivington Records super producer Bob Hyes, and his presence had made me skittish enough. But even considering the honoree, no one had expected Opal would show up. Ironic, considering shock was once her forte. She hadn't made the scene in decades, and that night her attire was subdued. She wore a simple black shirt dress with a yellow paisley turban hugging her scalp instead of one of the old, wild wigs. Still, I knew instantly who she was. I know her the same ways that you do, as Nev Charles's one-time partner in Strange, the ebony skin provocateur, the fashion rebel, the singer-screecher Afro-punk ancestor, the unapologetically Black feminist resurrected via GIFs and Instagram quotes for these intense political times. Of course, through my lens, so many other identities were superimposed. Here was my father's crazy girlfriend, the one he got himself killed for, the source of my mother's pain and, by extension, her frustrations with me, my most complicated idol. At first, when we collided, her gliding in through the door, me stalking out in the treacherous high heels I'd worn to walk the red carpet, Opal Jewel shot me the side eye of life, the honey please expression to launch a million new memes. And then she squinted as I scrambled to pick up her handbag. She raised my lowered head with a finger under my chin, and she called me by the first name I ever had, the name that my father, I would later learn, had intended for me, improvised from a dream. Saralina, she said, and it wasn't even a question. Jimmy's girl. It was a moment I had dreaded and fantasized about since I was 9. That was the year an older cousin, angry that I had beaten him in a tight game of Chinese checkers on our grandmother's front porch, said that my daddy had got his head kicked in over some ugly, bald-headed bitch. After I called him a liar, he snuck into our grandee's bedroom and pulled the old New York Times clipping from her cedar chest. Before I read the story on the Melee at Rivington Showcase, featuring Marion Jacoby's iconic photograph of Opal Nev and reporting my father as the one dead, I hadn't known any of it. All this seemed too much to blurt, standing face to face with Opal in the ladies' lounge. I wasn't a child. I was 43 years old, a top professional at one of my industry's starriest events. The lights in the lounge flickered to signal the start of the program, so I excused myself and hustled out. In the new gig, I had the privilege of being seated at one of the best tables in the house, right in front of the stage with the Times critics and the Netflix executives, but I could barely pay attention to the show. If you ever happen to stream it, there's a moment when the camera pans over the audience, and that's when you'll see me, a grave-faced Black woman wearing a choker necklace and a pile of dreadlocks atop her head. Everyone around me is smiling and singing along with Bruce Springsteen and Chrissy Hynde, but I am staring off somewhere, studying the monitors, on guard for the past. That night I did not see Opal buddying up with Nev and his team, and she wasn't seated anywhere near Bob Hayes' table either. From what I could tell, she wasn't even in the front half of the room that the cameras could catch. I was gulping water by that point, thinking that maybe the stress of the day and 3 glasses of champagne had made me dream the whole encounter, when the waiter came around again. In front of me, he dropped a puck of cheesecake, drizzled over with chocolate ganache and a note on yellow paper. I unfolded it. In red Sharpie was a phone number, followed by that famous autograph, the Opal in wide stance all caps, followed by the cut diamond shape. We met where Opal was staying in Harlem, in the same brownstone where she had lived with Virgil LaFleur when she first arrived in New York in 1970. LaFleur, her best friend and principal stylist, hovered around us on the parlor level, protective of Opal and skeptical of me. Off the record share, he chimed every 2 minutes. Eventually, she sent him out on a hunt for an elusive flavor of gelato conveniently found somewhere downtown. For more than an hour then, Opal Jewel and I were alone, and during that time she confirmed something I think I have known deep down since I was a teenager, growing up in a single-income apartment and yet shuttling off every morning to the toniest private school in Greater Philadelphia. Opal was the one who gave my mother the money for my education, straight through to my master's in journalism from Medill. During my visit, she was blunt and funny, edge-snatching as always, and when Virgil returned, she sent me away but told me I could see her in Los Angeles, if I were so inclined. On my next trip west, with my first cover as editor of Aural off to the printers, I pulled up to the Baldwin Hills address she'd given me. A note on the door directed me to the back of the house, where Opal, bald as you please, was smoking a joint in a rocking chair and directing an assistant gardener in the care of her tomato, okra, and basil plants. In the daylight, her dark skin glowed, still unlined despite her 67 years, and the high angle of her cheekbones, sitting above the deep V chin, gave her an ethereal, almost alien aspect. We talked for another 2 hours as the dusk came down and the air grew thick with gnats. Although our chats would eventually turn more fraught, as we circled the details of her fateful dalliance with my father, these early off-the-record moments were a dream. We touched on her childhood years, the development of her brash political philosophies and style, and how, 46 years ago now, she, an outcast Black girl from Detroit, and Nev, a goofy white English boy, had decided to take a chance on each other. No, these stories weren't totally new, but even skimming them at surface level, I could see a potential for something deeper, an opportunity to hear anecdotes and revelations I had never read in any of the old interviews with Opal, or even in the relative mountain of press and biography that exists today on Nev. At some point, the conversation turned toward me. Under the glow of tall citronella torches, Opal showed me an astonishing scrapbook she'd kept featuring my clips and columns, even tiny, terrible concert reviews of forgotten early 90s acts that had run in the Daily Northwestern. As we flipped toward the back of the scrapbook, we lingered on a tribute to the Ramones I'd written, following the death of last surviving original member Tommy Ramone, and the exclusive excerpt I landed from a new book of Joni Mitchell interviews. Then finally, the news, announced in Billboard complete with my headshot of my promotion. It dawned on me, she was leading me somewhere. You know I'm a professional busybody, I said. Why are you choosing to tell me all this? Then she casually dropped an incredible scoop. Nev had broached the idea of a North American reunion tour, starting with the headlining show at Summer 2016's Daring Do Festival. And though she had not performed live in more than 25 years, Opal was giving it serious thought. I struggled to keep my head from popping clean off. You want me to break this news? There's nothing to break yet, she said, still looking down at my picture instead of at me. I haven't decided to do a damn thing. Him and me, we just talking so far, but I wanted to know what you might think about that. What do you mean talking? Already I was seeing this tour in my mind, live wild bits of what I'd only witnessed in fuzzy YouTube clips, a rock and roll fantasy I'd assumed it impossible to fulfill, a flash of my mother's face, pained in the glow of televised highlights. Opal Jewel looked up at me finally, the scrapbook still open on the table in front of us. I'm trying to figure out if I'm up to it. I'm getting old. She swatted a hand in the air as if the idea were another gnat. Yet instantly I knew that this timing was smart. A tour had the potential to excite not only the Mercurials, as Opal and Nev's old cult of fans called themselves, but a new generation. Crowds ready to scream along with these crazy progenitors of dissidence and dissonance, that Black Lives Matter, that love is love, that the future is female. Ready to embrace Opal Jewel not as ahead of her time, but as now, now, now. I was thinking, she said, that you might get something out of this too. You know how these business types do. They got my head spinning crazy talking about promotions, I said, my heart pounding. They want a book. She nodded, squinting. She seemed to be searching my face for something. If I'm going to go back to that music, to me and to Nev and your daddy, to doing interviews again and whatnot, it seems like a decent place to start. And so on that pleasant night in Opal Jewel's garden, I charted in my head the book I would write, the definitive unpacking of the who's, hows, and whys surrounding the riot that killed my father and shot his weird friends and bandmates into our consciousness. I would report it as the latest volume in our oral history series, chronicling the origins of rock stars, and I dispensed just enough control emotion to make it more salable, more morning show ready. Little did I know that these plans would get waylaid. This end product, with its painful revisions of history, both my subjects and my own, is what follows. You might find it at times untamed and unwieldy, and that it contains no easy answers. But as I write these words now, embracing the funny, humbling way hindsight works, I promise my fellow Mercurials this. Though in moments it might break your heart, as it surely did mine, this story is the closest I can get to true. As Sonny Curtis, February 20th, 2017. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Donnie. That was great. Boy, these readings are tonic for the soul. They always are. Truth and beauty are always tonic for the soul. But in these times, I have to say, quite honestly, I feel better right now than I felt in days, if not weeks. Thank you. Thank you both. That was just absolutely wonderful. I think just for our MFA and BFA and all of our writing students, just what you've just seen are two examples of the power of the imagination freed and alive. and you just notice how deeply and thoroughly and beautifully imagined each of these two worlds are that we've just seen. Well, I have a couple of questions. Maybe to just get us started. Simeon, I'll just ask you I've got a million questions. I would love to just talk all day with both of you. But Simeon, with yours, I guess the one I'll ask is because I'm kind of a theology junkie, and I'm just waiting for that. So I'm just curious with from your reading and knowing that you were a religious studies major. I'm just curious about what that how those your religious studies background synthesizes into your work, if that makes sense.
For sure. I mean, it really is everything that I do. You know, I wasn't an English major. My love for narrative starts in religious stories. You know, I ended up focusing on nationalism at the University of Vermont. So there's kind of two different lines that I would say function here. First is the first draft of this novel was called Revelations from an Abandoned Colony of Eden, called City. I changed it because the title was kind of too long. And also after you say Revelations, you know, people and Eden also, it calls very directly to a Christian heritage. For me, you know, there's so many different, like there's so much about this book that I'm sure I'll talk about in time, but just to answer this question very directly about nationalism and about religion. So in terms of just Abrahamic traditions, I was rereading Revelations, and one thing that I noticed is that, you know, two things I noticed. First is that the Whore of Babylon riding in on the dragon becomes this kind of really obvious motif, you know, the return of Eve and the snake. So this was kind of the first thing I was thinking about trying to write in new traditions. I was thinking about trying to upend this kind of initial narrative, which we can't talk about until you guys get to the end of the book. So that might not help you too much. But essentially, what I recognize about Revelations is that part of the reason there's this huge obsession with Babylon as a place, or this huge obsession with city in this new work that I'm doing, is because it becomes the perfect staging ground for catastrophe, because you have such a large human scale. So what I noticed, I was just like, you know, if I was just, and I know this is blasphemous, I'm sorry to all my Christian family members, all the people that are out there, but just as a literary critic, I was going through Revelations. I was like, okay, well then he comes back, but where are we physically? And the kind of settings that return are the golden hall, this gilded hall at the end where everybody's singing, and this physical space of Babylon. So just for me, thinking about city as Babylon and how it functions symbolically was at the absolute front of my mind. And then in terms of nationalism, you know, I really started this project in 2016 after reading Rip Van Winkle after the election. I told you guys before, I teach English composition at Rutgers Newark. So I kind of paired the two readings of Recitative by Toni Morrison and Rip Van Winkle. And I think just meditating on kind of our election cycle and kind of national forgetting. We could talk about Niels Ray and nationalist theories, but I'll save that for later. Thank you for the question.
That's great. That's cool. And it's funny because while you were reading, I kept thinking about that wild imagery in the Bible, where like in Daniel or Ezekiel, where you have these astonishing visions that are all composed out of individually recognizable elements, but then when you put them all together, they're still mysterious and strange and kind of totally recognizable and totally mysterious and can be reducible. So that's very cool. I have a question for Donnie too. I'm sort of jealous because I'm not sort of jealous. I'm frankly jealous because I'm kind of, in addition to being a theology junkie, I'm also a junkie for any kind of musical biographies or documentaries. I will watch any documentary or read any bio on any musician. And I'm just, and this is also maybe for our students too, it's so simple. Like I never even thought like, oh, you have permission to write your own rock biography. That's just so cool, and to have it nested, the editor, the person talking about it. It's just, I wish I had done that. So one of the things I'm just interested with that too is just, and it applies to in both of your cases, but the in your case, I was thinking about an interview that you gave in which so I'll just quote what you say and then just lead into that. You said in this interview, you don't need to stick to a detailed map or even have a destination in mind before you sit down to start the damn story. It's okay not to know what you're driving toward. In fact, I found the not knowing can lead to more natural narrative movement and open the possibility of characters ending up in those, quote, surprising yet inevitable places. So I'm just wondering, with Envy, what it was like for you to imagine your way into these characters' lives and this, like a fictional musical career that they had.
Yeah. So I'll start talking a little bit about how I came to these characters, because this really did start with the idea for these two very strange people, Opal and Nev, coming together. I was watching, Paul, if you're a music documentary fan, you've surely seen Stop Making Sense, which is the concert film by Talking Heads. And I was watching the band play Slippery People, and you have David Byrne at center stage in his big square suit, rectangular suit. And then the camera pans over and you see two amazing Black women who are just like singing and dancing for their absolute lives. And I had the urge in that moment to pluck one of them, literally stick my hand in the screen and drag one of them to center stage with David Byrne. And that's how the idea started. It was sort of an urge that I had for weeks and weeks and weeks. And then I thought, well, maybe I should lean into this. Maybe there's something there. And so I started riffing and thinking, how would this pairing come to be? How, what would be the challenges of a group like this? What if I set it in a very turbulent time, in a time of change in the music industry? And it just started going from there. And I literally had no idea at the time what these characters were going to get into. And I would just I was just channeling voices, really, and having them talk about first their childhoods and kind of going through to this moment where they finally meet in Detroit, and what would those forces be that brought them together. And every time I got stuck in terms of the plot, I would just take a break from it, and I would go and take a notebook and go to a coffee shop. I remember once I went to Jones Beach here in New York, and I told myself, I'm not coming back until I figure out what happens next. And I sort of kind of was just pushing forward in that way. And, a lot of what I wrote ended up getting cut and getting changed. But I did have that sort of moment of like a character doing something very surprising and inevitable. And that was because I kept my mind open to the possibility of it. I didn't have a prescribed, structure or plot going forward. I just wanted the characters to kind of tell me what was happening, and then to have them sort of intersect in some way. And it ends up being like a very like major turning point in the story, which I won't talk about so as not to spoil it. But that's what worked for me with this one. I don't know about the next one.
Yeah. That's always it's a cliche, but it's all true. You always have to learn how to write each book.
Yes.
And I think it's great for everybody in the audience, but particularly our writers, to hear that. I think of it in my case as productive inefficiency. I just go and I just riff and I improvise and I riff, and it is like music. It's musical, it's lyrical, and you're just trying to catch what the syntax is. I often say I sort of know what the key and the time signature of something is before I know what it literally means. So that's great. So we have a question from Julie, about time and how you both work with time. She says that Donnie's preface is in the now, but about different points in the past. Simeon's is in a now that hasn't happened yet. So how do you manage your respective time warps? Asks Julie. Simeon, you want to?
Yeah, no, I don't really mind. However you want to do it.
Yeah, Simeon, you can answer.
Okay. Julie, thank you for that question. That was a really great question. I think in the name of riffing, we're riffing. So in the name of riffing off of what Donnie just said, I think that is very different for each book. So in the first book that I wrote, As Lies to Grin, there are two different times going on. One is the time of this fiction that the main character is writing, and the other time is the time of the days that are going by, much like this one. But I think the trick to any type of expression of time in fiction is your narrative voice. This latest project that I did is at least for me, I think it's an interrogation of narrative voice and how we as authors hide behind it and kind of how it's set up. So for me, I actually, in my first book, I never really asked the question, when is the time of the reading of the book and when is the time that whatever the book is in David's mind that we're given privilege to hear, when is that over? So in this book, in a very distinct way, I knew the narrator of the book, who's also the protagonist, knows the audience, and the audience is on the other side of this catastrophic event. And so very much the author is addressing the audience as if it's the last moment before he disappears. So in that way, it took me probably a year to figure out just that, because as both Paul and Donnie were just saying, like, it takes a long time to just play and to figure out where the book is going to go. What does it mean to interrogate the narrator? So that's kind of how I stumbled on the time of the book, is I recognize it's about the narrative voice, and then from there, when is the narrator when is the narrator telling the audience this story, which I don't think is something that I really considered the first time around.
Great, thanks. It's funny how so much of narrative is just about being in time. Just being in time.
A little Heidegger over there.
Give me, had to slip that in. Well, Hegel, anyways. But yeah, Heidegger. Donnie, what about you?
Yeah, so as I said, when I first started writing, it was just sort of channeling the voices of Opal and Nev, telling the story of how they kind of become famous in this violent moment. And those stories were roughly from 1967 until 1974. And I took an early version of that manuscript into my MFA program. And my classmates very smartly said, this is really good. This is really intriguing, but we're really curious about who is the person curating these interviews. And it started having me think about adding a present day layer, and in creating a character who had some personal tie to Opal and Nev's story. And I started playing around with the Sunny character and sort of her commenting. The way it's structured is it's mostly oral history interviews, and then Sunny interjects with sort of narrative about her process of interviewing and like meeting the characters, so you get to see them in present day. And then ultimately, I thought, I kind of want this to drive towards something that's very current, that's very political, especially because my first semester in my MFA program, Trump was elected. And that sort of gave the writing, it gave me the urge to be more bold and to be more political and to add an urgency to the work. And so I started layering in the present moment and started driving toward this reunion of Opal and Nev, which ends up being sort of a culmination of the book. And so it was definitely a process, and it was more of like a layering of elements and going back and editing. And it became a really cool thing of seeing these characters both in the past and in the present, and sort of like understanding the bridge between the past and the present.
Oh, that's great. And I love that, just the way you describe how you just take what's happening in the real world, just continually feeding into the work. So that there's one of the ways the work stays alive for you and for your readers, and it just takes oxygen from what's going on in your life at the time. It's great. I want to thank both of you so much for myself and on behalf of all of our audience, who I'm sure are going to be leaving feeling like they've just had a shot in the arm of just truth and beauty. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you both so much. And thank everybody in our audience for dropping in, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
all.